Welcome everyone to this morning's webinar. I'm Georgia, I'm co-founder of Sustainability Partnerships. This morning, I'm happy to say there's not actually very much from me. This entire event is going to be run from our partners at Inenco. So we've got Bethany Goodwin here and Jack Shepherd, who are going to be talking to everyone about carbon reporting and the differences and the nuances and what can be learned between both the private and public sectors. I'm going to pass you straight over to Beth. First of all, any housekeeping, please do use that chat function. Please ask questions throughout. Bethany has told me she's more than happy to field any questions throughout her entire session for the next hour this morning. She's going to go through a presentation with herself and Jack. You'll see me pop up again at the end of the session to round it off. Anything else, please use either the chat function or get in touch with myself or Bethany. I'm going to hand straight over to you now, Beth, if that's okay.
That's great.
And I'll leave you to it.
Brilliant. Well, hi everyone. This is going to be a really interesting webinar, I'm hoping. So what we're going to attempt to do today is a little bit of a tour of the differences and the similarities between the public and private sector when it comes to sustainability and carbon reporting. So there are quite a broad range of these, and we're going to start you off with a little bit of a timeline of how we got here. So I'm just going to set my pointer options up for later. And hopefully you can all see my screen now and see the slides. So it's myself, I'm Beth Goodwin, and I'm Senior Account Manager for the NHS at Inenco. And then we've got my counterpart who is Jack Shepherd, and I'll let him introduce himself later, but he's essentially our carbon reporting expert. So we're going to do a little bit of public versus private today. Over to you, Jack.
Thanks, Bethany. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. Yes, Jack Shepherd. So I work at Inenco. My role is the product manager for carbon and energy reporting. So it's my job to look after how we support our clients in reporting around carbon, and I also deliver a range of different services myself as well. But I've been doing this kind of thing since 2007. So yeah, on we go. So we're starting here with a timeline. This is just the first of a couple of slides on this for the private sector sort of carbon reporting. What has happened over the years on the private sector side? So I suppose broadly, what I would say first off is that it's been a move perhaps away from the world of like CRC reporting, the carbon reduction commitment reporting, which is what we were all doing back in the tens, that was effectively ended up being a very complex carbon tax, very mandated, lots of rules, and it was very complex. And the government have moved away from that kind of approach to carbon reporting towards more of a sort of something that I would typify as put it in the public domain and you lot figure it out approach, which means basically that, you know, we're seeing more and more disclosure around carbon being mandated for companies to put them into their annual report, and that's had an interesting effect because it's forced companies to put it in next to their financial figures. And so for a consultant, suddenly rather than talking to the engineering guy, the facilities management people, I'm suddenly talking to the company secretaries and the FDs, because they want to make sure that these things are right, because this information is sat next to their financial figures. So they want to make sure it's right. They want to make sure it makes them look good. They want to know what their competitors are saying and whether they look better than them or not. So it's quite a clever approach, I think. But broadly then, specifically, as I say, 2013, this became mandatory for PLCs to put this information in their annual report. 2019, that got expanded to under SECA, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, to all large companies with some thresholds around staff numbers and turnover. And then the next thing I would mention is this year we're now seeing a requirement for, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, if a company wants to bid for public sector money for a contract worth more than 5 million a year, they now need to provide a carbon reduction plan as part of that. So that has certainly got a lot of companies thinking we need a carbon management plan. So that's a reduction plan, I should say, sorry. So that's a baseline figure for carbon footprint, a most recent figure, and a target, crucially, and then what you're doing about it, and also some scope 3 stuff as well. So that's certainly put the cat amongst the pigeons a bit. Next slide, please, Beth.
Absolutely. Give me a second. It's not moving. There we go.
And then the last thing I want to talk about is TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That is essentially now the next stage is, okay, so you've put your carbon emissions in the public domain, great. Now you have to also put in the public domain what you're doing about it. So what's your governance structure around for addressing the carbon agenda? And that's not only how are you going to reduce your carbon footprint, but also what are you going to do about inevitable climate change? And then what are you doing about it? How are you measuring it? How are you identifying risks and opportunities? And how are you mitigating those risks and opportunities? That became mandatory for premium listed companies on the London Stock Exchange from 2021. So basically you're going to see those first reports coming out early next year, their 2021 annual reports, and then the 2022 annual reports that's getting expanded to large companies as well, not just premium listed. So you're going to see a real step up in terms of businesses having to put this, having to say exactly what they're doing about climate change into the public domain. So that's it's certainly very, very interesting times. And I think that's the end of my timeline.
Yeah, so I'm going to just do a quick comparison of sort of where the NHS has come across this journey as well. And it's quite a similar journey in terms of the path and the direction of travel. So you can see back in 2008 was the first time the SDU was established. And that was specifically to try and address the Climate Change Act and find a way for the NHS to aim at those targets. And the way that we were looking at things back then was with the GCC tool, which was based around greenhouse gas protocols. So it was very similar in terms of what we were doing. That has obviously evolved, particularly in more recent years, and things have been speeding up. So in theory, everyone will have had SDMPs back in sort of 2009, 2010s, and you will have been looking at plans, sustainable development management plans for your trusts. These were really quite broad, and there wasn't a lot of focus around what needed to be reported within them. But it started to expand. So you needed to have a section discussing sustainability and climate change in your annual reports from 2010. It wasn't particularly policed, this. So a number of trusts still won't have necessarily been meeting these targets. These were things that were set, but they weren't very heavily policed by the central team. So in 2017, the GCC tool became the Sustainable Development Assessment tool. And that was a really broad tool. Those of you who filled it in, Jack and I have been filling these in ourselves, and they're always good fun. 300 statements across the whole range of everything the trust does on sustainability. We'll talk a little bit about the broadness of that scope later on, but essentially we were looking at things that even in TCFD are not yet being considered back in 2017. So at this point, the NHS is well beyond where the private sector was, starting to consider things like adaptation, consider risks from climate change back in 2017. And starting to target your way forwards and look for a way of how you're going to mitigate that. So now where we are, we've had green plans introduced. And as of this year, so everyone should be procuring Rego backed green electricity. So that was the first thing that you needed to do as of April this year. And you've now got your green plan guide, which explains exactly what needs to be covered in every green plan. And those obviously being published to your ICS in January next year. Now, what this has also come along at the same time as is the SStat tool being retired. And we are expecting to see early next year a replacement tool for that. Now, it'll be very interesting to see where that goes, whether we focus more in on the carbon or if it remains as broad a sustainability tool. And of course, you've got your two big targets, which we will touch on later, which is quite different from the private sector because you guys have your targets set centrally. And you aren't really being given very much input into that. These are seen as reasonable targets and the whole of the sector should be working towards it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to start the comparisons here with a little bit of a comparison between SECA reporting and the NHS carbon footprint reporting. And I'm going to let Jack talk you through what the different scopes are under SECA and how that works. I'm sure a lot of you know this already, and I apologise if it's a little bit basic, but it's always good to do a little bit of a recap. Over to you, Jack. You're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to go through in detail in a couple of slides, but this is just a kind of overview of it from the private sector side. So for those of you not familiar with the concept of scopes, carbon reporting dictates that your emissions get broken into different scopes, and they basically go from 1 to 3, 1 being stuff you really have to make sure you look after, and 3 being stuff that's less important. So scope 1 is stuff you burn in things you own, vehicles, boilers, bonfires, whatever they might be. If you burn it and it's in something you own, it's your scope 1. And also there's other ways to release carbon or global warming gases apart from burning stuff. They can just leak out of things like refrigeration units, or people who have just inhaled an anesthetic gas who exhale it again, or all those sorts of things. So these all have global warming potential. So these are fugitive emissions, and that's all scope 1. It comes out of directly, the emissions come from things that you own. Scope 2 is basically electricity, so it's generated elsewhere, but you use it. It also would include steam if you're buying in steam and things like that. And scope 3 is everything else. And it's a very broad category, scope 3, everything from employee commuting, purchasing, what happens with the products that you sell. If you sell products, how much energy are they using in their usage? All a very broad range of things. The key thing to know about scope 3 is that scope 3 emissions are other companies' scope 1 and 2 emissions. So they are primarily the responsibility of other businesses to report under their scope 1 and 2. So generally, that's the approach that the private sector takes, is report your scope 1 and 2 and keep an eye on your scope 3, but not necessarily set targets for scope 3 reductions. There's some slight. There is a few little bits of scope 3 that go into SECA, but I will talk about that in a slide or two.
Yeah. So you'll all be pretty familiar with this graphic, I hope, which is fairly similar in some ways to the previous graphic. And you can see how the NHS choose to look at reporting. And again, it's split into these scopes 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that the majority of the things that you're looking at as your footprint are within that scope 1 and 2. And you've got a little bit of scope 3 coming in there as well that you're directly reporting on and directly looking to reduce. Where you've got all of this other scope 3, which is outside and including some patient and visitor travel, which is even outside of the greenhouse gas protocols scopes completely. But you've got some things in here which are similar to on the previous graph, upstream and downstream of you. So these are the responsibility of other people. These are responsibility of your supply chain, and they are quite difficult to monitor and target. But you have a target for these to reach net zero, which is very distinct from what the private sector does, because within the private sector, it would be seen as probably untenable to target a net zero on all of this scope 3 because it's outside of your control. The view from the NHS is that obviously you're a large purchaser of goods, and you can wield some level of influence over what's going on here, and you can start to manipulate other companies and change the way that other companies approach things. So it's essentially throwing your weight around as a large organisation, and it's going to be really ambitious, this. So we're going to do a little comparison now on the next graph of what the actual reporting requirements look like when it comes to footprint. So you should be able to see up on screen now. What we've done is we've essentially taken the NHS carbon footprint, what is usually reportable under streamlined carbon reporting for a normal company, and what is reportable under streamlined carbon reporting for a listed company, for a larger company. And you can see here the vast majority, the NHS is doing more than the private sector is in terms of what it's capturing and what it needs to report on. And this is a big step change from CRC. Most of you where you've been doing carbon reporting previously, it's been CRC scope. We've not even been doing all of the natural gas. So we've been doing just building energy and not even all of the natural gas that's burnt on site. So huge change, and a lot of you have been struggling to get hold of some of this data, upscaling your reporting to make sure it's all captured. You will see at the bottom there's a couple there where the NHS aren't doing them and they're part of SECA, and we'll touch on those towards the end of the slide. But I'm going to hand over to Jack and let Jack just talk through a little bit of the differences between the two SECAs, and where the gaps are and why the gaps are there.
Yeah, so essentially, obviously, so SECA listed there, you could read that to be PLCs, so it's the larger companies, and these have been reporting this information since 2013, and the SECA takes a if you're a quoted company, listed company, then you have a broader scope that you need to report against. But basically, they just make it a little bit easier for non-listed companies, so for large but not PLC companies, and they exclude a few of the more difficult to report elements. Of course, it's SECA. These are just guidelines. So many businesses do report beyond what they're required to, simply because they think, well, this is the nature of our business, that we're going to generate a lot of refrigerant gases, and so we think this is important, say, to include in our reporting. But yeah, I suppose it's noteworthy that say waste isn't included in SECA, which is it's a fairly common sort of sustainability element. Waste and water emissions from that is something that you tend to see waste on any list of sustainability sort of metrics, but actually, in terms of the carbon impact of it, it is quite small generally, compared to say electricity use and gas use, obviously depending on the nature of your business. And yeah, so I think it's interesting just to look at the bottom two rows.
Just before we do, Jack, can I jump in? I just wanted to say on waste and water, it probably gives quite a good indication of the difficulties with scope 3, I think, maybe, because you're paying another company to take away your waste. So at the point that you pay them, it becomes their responsibility and not yours. So that's well into your scope 3 then at that point, and in theory, outside of your control as to how green the disposal of that waste is. It's their responsibility. And the same with water. You can't make the water that you're purchasing from others any greener unless you've got your own private source. You're pretty stuck with whatever they're doing, and it's whoever's supplying to you. But yeah, they are probably the two that stick out the most as a glaring thought of, yes, we should include this because we need to understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to mention as well is that relatively recently, but certainly now, you're seeing the effects of changes to allow businesses to report, to reflect the fact that they've invested in a zero carbon tariff, electricity tariff generally, in their reporting. This isn't specific to the private sector. I'm sure NHS trusts will be doing that as well with the mandated low carbon tariff coming up, but yeah, you're starting to see businesses reflect that their investment in low carbon tariffs in their reporting now.
Yeah, that's something that from the NHS perspective we've been talking about a little bit, because they'll be declaring zero on electricity, whereas under SECA you would report also your grid equivalent, wouldn't you, to show what that would be that you're consuming.
That's right. Yeah. So under SECA, you do have to use the old grid factors as well. You have to report both sets of figures. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. People are using that quite a lot to try and still see the benefits of reducing consumption on electricity. And it is something we get a lot of questions from NHS about is, well, what's the benefit if I now put solar panels on my roof when I'm already net zero in terms of my electricity? And it's very difficult to actually show any benefit realistically. You're looking at just consumption and costs.
Absolutely. And it is interesting times in terms of how much that low carbon electricity is going to cost, and what we're seeing a real increase in the premium that suppliers are charging for zero carbon electricity. And so lots of businesses who've sort of set their stall out saying, these are our carbon emissions. We've already halved our carbon emissions thanks to our low carbon tariff, and now they're seeing they're finding themselves a bit exposed to that cost. So it's interesting times on that front.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I'll let us get back on track and go down and talk about consumption and intensity now.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So yeah, I think this is an interesting difference. So consumption, you have to under SECA report your kilowatt hours of gas, electricity, diesel, anything else, as well as your tons of CO2 resulting from it. So that sort of allows the world to sort of check your calcs, but also it forces businesses to sort of get a sense of not just their carbon intensity, but their energy intensity, which are two very different things. And only one of them really is a true reflection of the efficiency of their business, and that's energy intensity. And then also the private sector has to report an intensity metric, a carbon intensity metric. So the most common one is tons of CO2 per £1 million turnover this year. And you report it for this year and you report it for previous years. And what that does is it gives you a step towards being able to compare two different businesses together. So if you have two businesses in a very similar industries, and one has tons of CO2 per £1 million turnover much higher than another one, then that might ask some questions. Generally, there might be perfectly reasonable answers for it. And the question I've been asked my whole career when I present a carbon footprint to a business is that good? And generally the answer is, it depends. It's not an easy question to answer, but the fact that the NHS is not obliging companies to report, or trusts to report, an intensity metric is interesting.
It is, and I think one of the things that's most interesting is which you would pick. So I know patient number is the really common one. That's the one that most often we look at when we're looking at intensity of consumption. But obviously different trusts have different types of patients and different intensity of surgeries or inpatient outpatients. It all feeds into this. And I think that's something that I would like to see Central NHS team come up with, is how would you like to report on an intensity metric going forwards? And how are you going to allow that to mean that you can compare a community trust to an acute, or is that even possible? Because at the moment, there'll be a huge focus on the acute trusts here because of your carbon footprints and how much more they are. But that doesn't necessarily mean that actually you're doing worse than a community trust that's not done anything. And intensity wise, they may actually be in a worse position than you. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how that develops going forwards.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't really know if the intention is to allow comparability between trusts. You know, is that something that is wanted?
We'll find out. So I'm going to let Jack talk to you a little bit about some target setting. So obviously we've talked about the fact the NHS has targets. So this is a little bit about how private sector approaches target setting. And this is just one approach. And some of you will have heard of science-based targets before as well, and you will have looked at these. But I'm just going to let Jack give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of a science-based target.
Yeah, I mean, so companies have been setting carbon reduction targets for many years. And certainly, you know, a lot of businesses have been patting themselves on the back saying, you know, look at that. Over the last 5 years, we've reduced our carbon emissions by 25%. Isn't that brilliant? Well done, us. The fact is that's generally been because the carbon intensity of UK grid electricity has been reducing. And so just by using the same amount of electricity, you're going to see your carbon footprint drop significantly year on year. And then, you know, targets have been set in different ways. It's been hard to sort of compare them and that sort of thing. So hence this thing called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So it's not just a methodology, it is an organization and a group of people who will tell you, basically you submit all this information to them about your company's target, and they tell you whether you can consider that a science-based target or not. And the idea behind science-based targets is that, okay, if we want to keep the world to only a 1.5 degree temperature increase, how much carbon can we emit, or how much does the world need to reduce its carbon emissions by? And then with that figure is then kind of broken down across countries and sectors and businesses, so that each individual business gets target gets dictated a target by these calculations that is science-based, that is them doing their bit to ensure that the global warming doesn't go over 1.5 degrees. And so or indeed 2 degrees, there's sort of two levels. So yeah, that's it really. So you can submit your information. It's hard to get through, and you know, I've had businesses that have not managed to reach an agreement with the science-based targets for a reasonable target for them. But once you've got it, you're in the gang. You can, you know, shout from the rooftops, and you're on the websites, and you can pat yourselves on the back. And they're currently moving towards setting to releasing a net zero science-based target. So if you want to say, that would really be the sort of gold standard of carbon reduction targets, to say you have a net zero science-based target.
Yeah, and then all you have to do is try and actually meet it.
Yeah.
You know, once you're shouting about what target you're going to achieve, then you've got to actually put your plan in place to meet it. We're not talking plans today. Sorry, guys. We'll do that another time.
No.
So I'm going to nip back to the NHS and look at the difference between your two targets here. So obviously you've got your net zero target for your carbon footprint, and then your net zero target for your carbon footprint plus. And that's not a big time difference between the two when you're looking at this. And so what I wanted was to just touch on the scale of this scope 3 and some of the ways that you're approaching this and approaching this scope. So obviously we look at about 24% for the actual carbon footprint, and then 76% of this is stuff that you can't directly control, but you can influence. And to get that down to net zero by 2045 is hugely ambitious, as we've said. Now, what's come out last week is this. A lot of you will have seen this slide already. I'm not going to talk through all of it, but this links up with what Jack mentioned on his timeline and the start of the impact of what the NHS is doing onto the private sector. And we are seeing this. Some of our private sector companies who are suppliers to the NHS have been in touch. They're wanting to talk about how they're going to put carbon reduction plans in place. They can see that 2024 deadline there is not particularly far away in terms of all suppliers to publicly report emissions and publish a carbon reduction plan. That's a fairly close timescale for a private sector company wanting to start looking at how am I going to supply into the NHS. If they're retendering to you guys in 2023, they're going to want to have one of these in place. So we're seeing that impact already coming through our private sector companies, and that's going to increase, and we're expecting to see it increase. And obviously you've got the PPN 0621, which is for 23, but only for anything above 5 million, which is not all of your suppliers. It's not a lot of your suppliers. As that starts to ramp down to smaller suppliers, that's when I'm expecting by the time we get to around 28, this is going to be pretty securely embedded in the private sector, in we need to meet the NHS's requirements. What can you do to help us meet those NHS requirements? And that will become an additional thing that private sector companies are looking at, and a significant number of them. I mean, how are you feeling, Jack, about that transition and the companies that have been asking us? Obviously, we have some private healthcare companies we work with as well who talk about this.
This transition to requiring carbon reduction plans. Yeah. It's well, it's as I said, it's certainly driving people to my phone and my inbox, asking questions and needing to get these things in place pretty quickly. Generally, they're often sort of combining them with a science-based target. So they're saying, okay, if we need to have a carbon reduction plan anyway for public sector contracts, we might as well also get a science-based target at the same time, because equally many businesses now are saying we will only procure from businesses who have set science-based targets. So that's a sort of equivalent pressure to this PPN 0621 in the supply chain.
Yeah, and I think for me, the thing that I think is going to be really interesting is when we get to the products. That carbon footprinting for individual products, there are very few companies that have that at the moment, who have a life cycle carbon impact of their products that they can pass on to people they're selling them to. And that, again, it's ambitious to have that in place for all products by 2028, but it will be really interesting if we can get there. We're going to start seeing some big shifts in terms of what looks good on a tender. So all of this comes back to sustainability. So we've talked carbon the whole way through this. And now I'm just going to broaden it back out and talk a bit about what's the bigger picture here. Because yes, we can all aim for a net zero carbon. We can all try and help in that respect, but sustainable development isn't just carbon. And a lot of the things that the NHS have been doing have been based around these UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that goes all the way back to the GGC. I'm just looking at the typo in there in our title. And then the SDAT. And I expect is going to roll through into the coming tool as well. Because the NHS doesn't just have an ambition to be a net zero organisation, it also wants to be a sustainable organisation. And we'll talk about healthcare without harm for a very short moment towards the end of this. But this obviously is in the private sector as well, isn't it, Jack? So this forms the basis of a lot of things when you go right back. We may have come away from some of those sustainability goals initially, but we're starting to see them come back through. So in terms of the NHS, this is your green plans. And your green plans are to try and encapsulate not just the carbon side of things, but also some of the sustainability side and some of those areas of focus. And the new guidance splitting into these areas of focus, particularly for me, when you get down and you start looking at some of the things that we're talking about when it comes to food and nutrition, and some of the things we talk about on adaptation, those are really crucial from my perspective. And the same with sustainable models of care. We see a lot more talk about what can we do as anchor organisations within the community going on, and a lot more about actually improving the state of the community that you live in. And that's sort of at the crux of where we go with UN sustainability goals. In terms of the private sector, this is mostly seen in this TCFD that's coming through now. So I'll let Jack just talk a little bit about where that goes and what it asks for in terms of sustainability on a broader context.
Yeah, so I mean, TCFD is focused on carbon. It is climate related, task force for climate related financial disclosures. So it is talking about the carbon agenda, but there are obviously other elements of reporting in the private sector that do take a much broader approach to sustainability. But overall, it feels like those are fairly well established, and that the changes that we're seeing now really are much more in the world of carbon. But yeah, TCFD basically says you have to have a section in your annual report that talks about that gives your TCFD disclosure, and you have to talk about what you're doing to mitigate, to reduce climate change, and what you're doing to address inevitable climate change and the risks that presents to your business, such as overheating and flooding and things like that. And so you have to talk specifically about the governance structure that you have in place, how you manage it, what the roles are, how you identify, act on and mitigate and quantify risks and opportunities, actually. So interestingly, it also talks about opportunities broadly. The audience, you could say, for a TCFD disclosure would be the company's investors. So if companies want to get a sense of, are these guys on top of the carbon agenda? Am I investing in a business which has got a handle on this? How exposed do I think this business is to these issues? The TCFD disclosure would be where you'd find out that information. And then obviously you have to talk about the strategy you've got in place to address to take these, to mitigate these risks and take these opportunities. And you have to declare the metrics and targets you've got in place. That's where you would talk about your science-based targets that you have in place and things like that.
Yeah, so it hits on maybe 3 of the 9 topics, I think, within a green plan at TCFD. And some of these are really crucial. Obviously, those of you who are looking at it, your governance side, when you're looking at your personnel and your policies, there's a huge amount of overlap there. And I imagine we're having very similar conversations with board members now that you've got your board sustainability leads. We're having the same conversations of, how is this going to make us look? When this is in the public domain, how is it going to make us look as an organisation? Because trusts, as much as we are different to private sector, we still want to look good. Individual trusts still want to look better than their peers. And it's always quite competitive once you get to director level, as you'll all know. So I'm going to really briefly touch on the really broad side, which I'm not going to read all of this on the side. You all know about healthcare without harm at this point, and the global initiative to try and make healthcare a champion. And you can see that includes both climate change, supply chain across the globe, looking at how the supply chain for healthcare impacts on sustainability and your environmental health. So it's really amazing what's going on here in the collaboration, not just from our country, but across the whole of the world, looking to try and make healthcare a pioneer in terms of sustainability and carbon. And it's going to be really interesting how that develops. I think the last thing before we open up and we do some questions, I can't see any questions in the chat yet, so do please start getting them in. It would be great to have a bit of an open forum on this for the last 15 minutes when we get there. Is the thing that I see that has the most parallels when I'm looking at green plans and I'm looking at the NHS trying to be a sustainable organisation is probably B Corp at the moment. And I think B Corp is very new. It's not legislative. It is all voluntary, and it's still a very young organisation. But it's an interesting approach. And if you ever do have a chance to click through, you can click through and access their form of how they actually assess companies, and click through and view some of the applications that other companies have made to become a B Corporation. Obviously, you'll know about Brewdog, but there are a lot of companies on here, Patagonia, and it's all about making sure that they are the most sustainable business possible. And some of the targets in here are very similar to what the NHS is trying to do. So I hold this up as sort of if a company is going for B Corp status, they're making a very big statement, is what I would say. Jack, do you think that's the way that you view it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's for many businesses, carbon emissions and the carbon agenda is the key thing that they want to talk about, and the thing that they really feel the pressure on, sort of depending really on the nature of the business. Obviously, if they're a very energy intensive business or things like that. But if you talk, for example, to a clothing retailer about sustainability, then they're not going to mention carbon footprint in the first couple of minutes of talking to them. They're going to be talking obviously about their supply chain, about the risk of slavery or exploitation in their supply chain, and how where they source stuff from, and all that sort of thing. And so, and then also, of course, supermarkets, people with organizations with large complex supply chains, they see other risks as shouting much more loudly than the carbon agenda, and so many of those will be looking to organizations like B Corp to get a badge to say that they're doing well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether any NHS suppliers start to head in this direction or not, because at the moment it's very much organisations that rely on clients purchasing their products who have a sustainability focus. It's mostly retail that are looking at B Corp at the moment. It will be interesting to see if it comes into the wider manufacturing realm at all, or if it remains something for essentially me and you as consumers. Great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. That is the end of our slideshow, and I can see a couple of people have been talking in the chat. Hi Sam, yes, we will be sending out, I can see Georgia will be sending out a recording, I believe, of the presentation afterwards. Anyone got any questions about this? Now you've got me and Jack for another 15 minutes, and we do like to have our brains picked, and we don't mind difficult questions, so go for it. I'm not seeing any popping up in the Q&A. So should we have a bit of a chat, Jack? Any questions that you've got for me in terms of sort of what we're seeing NHS side? Do
you think the NHS is going to take a stronger focus on carbon, or is it still going to be this sort of blanket catch-all broad approach?
It's interesting. I think I would like it to remain a catch-all approach. My personal view is that you cannot, as a healthcare organisation, stop looking at things like biodiversity and social prescribing, and the movement is already in place, and we're seeing more of that movement going on. It wouldn't surprise me if there's a few more carbon questions in the new tool, though. It wouldn't surprise me if when that new tool comes out, there's a little bit more of a focus on that, because some of the things that you are absolutely being asked to target that are in the standard contract weren't captured within the SDAT tool. And you and I have seen that when we've been putting green plans together, is that there's things that don't quite fit. So it'll be interesting to see if the new tool adds in some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wonder if there's going to be some kind of equivalent to TCFD on the way for the public sector, requiring them to specifically say what they're doing about climate-related risks.
Yeah, I can see a couple of things coming through in the chat now, both about how to quantify scope 3 emissions mostly, which is an interesting question. I'm going to just address the scopes 1 and 2 to begin with. So scopes 1 and 2, most organisations like ourselves can help you with that. That's our bread and butter. We can get you your NHS carbon footprint side. When you get into the footprint plus and you're looking at the broader scope 3s, there are companies out there that are specializing in this. They are not offering particularly high accuracy levels at the moment in terms of what they'll be reporting. The error margins are huge. The NHS yourselves, you do have a tool which centrally you can go in and use, which will give you an estimate. And I know the central team are working to improve on those and get more and more information, which is where some of these targets are coming from, so that we can actually start to ask a company for the carbon footprint of a product when you're purchasing it. At the moment, for scope 3, for the footprint plus, I'm not really looking at you defining it, what your actual footprint plus looks like. You can get an estimate, but it's going to be very broad. So from your side, what I would be looking at is putting in place your policies, putting in place your strategies, so that you're asking the right questions of your supply chain. And starting to drive them in the right direction, rather than immediately trying to quantify. And I'm sure NHS centrally will be looking to get you something quantifiable so that they are doing that. And it's not just on you individually.
Definitely. Ask them if they've got a science-based target.
Yeah. As part of your procurement exercise, ask what their targets are. Ask if they've got a plan already. Can they provide it? There's no reason why you can't be asking for these things ahead of time. And I'm sure, obviously, you guys have Cahoots. You've got your central resources. You can talk to each other. Get your procurement teams talking to each other about what you're putting in tenders, because there will be certain trusts who are further ahead than others. And if you're doing a tender for a particular product, I guarantee you someone else has already looked at it from a sustainability and social value perspective and will have ideas. And it is one of the few big advantages you guys have got as trusts, is that you can collaborate like that and you can steal off each other in terms of use. Definitely.
I mean, the world of scope 3 is a graveyard littered with people's ambitions for carbon reduction, because you can blunder off into scope 3 and end up investing a huge amount of time and energy in quantifying your scope 3 emissions, only to sort of get to the point where you think, right, we've made all this effort, what can we actually do about it? And if we do something about it, how will we know whether it's done any good without doing the whole thing again next year? So yeah, this is really why the GHG protocols has scopes 1, 2, and 3. Get your scope 1 and 2 house in order, and find ways to influence your scope 3, but trying to declare definitively these are all of our scope 3 emissions, I'm not sure that is a good waste of anyone's time, a good use of anyone's time at the moment.
And just know, Isabella, just to answer, we're not working on a tool for scope 3 across all hospitals. That's not us. We will help where you may potentially an individual product and an individual thing you're looking at, and we can do that. But that big piece where you're looking at a full scope 3 assessment, that really should be central. NHS England are starting to help you guys with that, and we are just a private sector company. So from our perspective, we would say that's something that you'll be working on centrally as the NHS at the moment. But obviously companies like ourselves can assist where there are specific sticking points and specific things you need. I'm going to get Jack to answer Evie's question here on whose responsibility is it to report on carbon?
Well, it depends whose name's on the bill, I suppose, is the easiest way to answer that. If your name's on the energy bill, or your organization's name is on the energy bill, and as long as you're not passing that energy use on to a tenant, then that's for you to report. So yeah, but that's really what the different scopes are there for. So you report your scope 1, stuff you burn and things you own, and stuff that leaks out of stuff you own. The scope 2, electricity you buy, and then select bits of of scope 3.
Okay. Anything else? Anyone else got any more questions? We've still got 10 minutes. So if there is anything that you'd like us to talk about, we're happy to. Okay, I think from my side, Jack, just a quick one in terms of a question on what you're seeing as excellence. So what do you see? I'm not going to ask for specific companies or anything like that, obviously, because we don't want to get ourselves in trouble. But in terms of like the best things that are going on in the private sector right now, what are you seeing?
I suppose the thing that I'm seeing in terms of excellence, working with a private healthcare company at the moment, and they have set that basically the executive board's bonuses depend on them delivering carbon reductions each year. They've set a target for net zero, and each year they have to deliver a reduction towards that target in 2030. And there's some significant bonuses attached to them meeting those targets each year. And I've never seen an organization, this isn't something that organization I worked with has done so explicitly, maybe in the past before, they are so keen now on delivering these reductions. They're rolling out a whole raft of initiatives to reduce the carbon of the energy they use, and also to use less energy. And they really are doing a great job, and it's all kind of hanging off the fact that there are these bonuses tied to this carbon reduction. So
that's
interesting,
because I think we're seeing similar. So when we're talking to trusts at the moment, we're seeing the situation where now you have a board sustainability lead, and that board sustainability lead is the person whose head it's going to land on if you don't get a green plan into your ICS in January. We have seen a raft of panic across trusts where they've suddenly found themselves thinking, this is something that actually needs priority and focus outside of estates. And that's mostly because it's now been made someone accountable at board level. So it'll be interesting. I mean, that would be a huge jump if that kind of thing was introduced into the NHS. I doubt it will be, Rachel, we'll see. But it's certainly something aspirational if you make it so that your board are that driven. It would be fantastic. Yeah, I like that as an idea. We've had a question just about 2024. I'm thinking you're probably thinking this is a target for suppliers to have a carbon reduction plan, looking at what's been going on in terms of the side of things, Charlotte. I think that is realistic. I do. I think it is something that private sector knew was coming. Most people who are involved in public sector supply chains, they knew this was coming at some point. And we've been talking to them about carbon reduction for a long time and how are they doing it, and get yourself organised. So I think it's ambitious, and I think a lot of them will be uncomfortable, and I think some of them will be left behind. But I do think that most companies that are supplying into the NHS are in a position where they will look at this now, and they will start to think about it now, and they'll have one in place in a year or two, because they want to be seen as ahead of the curve. They want to be able to come into your tenders and shout about how much better than their competitors there are. So, yeah. Hi, Helen. Yeah, absolutely. Let me pop it back up on screen. There we go. Can you see that on screen now?
Yep.
Excellent. So yeah, in terms of the areas of focus, so this is just taken directly from the Green Plan guidance. So it's just the sections that you need to have in your Green Plan when it's published in January. So the Green Plan guidance came out in June, and hopefully you've all read it and seen it at this point. So these are the main areas of focus your Green Plan needs to cover, and the way it is put on the guidance is these are your sections. So every Green Plan should be broken down into these headings when it is published. So your workforce and system leadership, that's including a lot of policy stuff in here, but also a lot about what you're doing for your staff. So there are some aims in here from organisations, particularly if you look into what was in the SStat tool. A lot of this is focused on education of staff. It's focused on well-being of staff. And sort of looking at your policies to protect them. Sustainable models of care, you go into looking at the clinical side of things and starting to look at what could you do differently. It's not a huge section this yet, but I'm expecting it to be growing. Digital transformation, again, you're looking at trying to digitize your estate. So some of this at the moment is just looking at going paperless as far as possible, and remote care where possible, and some of these things. Your travel and transport is self-explanatory. We're looking at your plans for electrification, whether you're looking at hydrogen, fuel cells, all of that kind of thing. Estates and facilities, you get into a lot of the waste and water and your actual heat decarbonisation planning in here, and looking at your estate strategy and what that's going to look like going forwards. For your medicines, this is where you're talking about your anaesthetic gases targets, looking to get rid of your desflurane as much as possible. And then you're going on to supply chain and procurement, which you can see is just one small section in here. It's that huge amount of what you're doing, but it's just one small section in here. And it's almost all focused around what are you doing to encourage your supply chain to be green, and to go down that route, and looking at your policies for procurement. Food and nutrition, there's a lot in here about helping your local community. There's a lot in here about what you're doing to give advice to keep people healthy. So that's really interesting. And then finally, adaptation, which is a small section, but hugely critical, which is understanding how your buildings are going to be impacted by climate change and flood risk, and how things are going to change for your estate going forwards, and how things are going to change for your local community as well going forwards, and what pressures they're going to be under. So real whistle stop tour there. I'm gonna just stop sharing again. I can see there's some more comments coming up in the chat, but any more comments on that, Helen? Anything else that I didn't touch on that you wanted me to? Just while we wait, I can just see, is anyone encouraging trust-wide ideas for sustainability and the benefits from the ground up? Yes, they are, and even the central NHS team hugely encouraging this at the moment and looking for champions and championing good news. If you've got good news from your trust, send it in to the Greener NHS team. They are publicising these hugely, and a lot of this is going to be learning from each other as we go. And sometimes that might just be a random individual. It might be an individual nurse who happens to work for your trust who has a fantastic idea and implements it. And it's something that we talk about quite a lot. We talk about when you're doing sustainability, it's finding that person who is leading, even if they're not in a leadership role, and championing what they're saying and making sure that it is given the focus that it needs and that people will adopt it and listen to it. And that's sort of your role when you're in a leading role in sustainability. Yeah, absolutely. It's all comms really at the moment, and getting that community within the NHS. And I'm hoping your ICSs are going to do a lot more of this next year. I'm hoping you're going to find that actually maybe your green champions and your working groups, that you have leads of those going to working groups where you're talking to other trusts as well, and councils, and your local universities, and seeing what everyone is doing, because public sector's got to work together on it. It is your big advantage over the private sector, Jack, just to bring you back into the conversation. Private sector, it's all competitors. You can't really learn from each other in the same way, can you? No,
you've got to be very careful what you share, and they all want to know what each other are doing, but it's hard to find out. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing I would mention there is that I don't think the world is using half-hourly data well enough. So generally most hospitals will have half-hourly electricity and gas data, so you can see how much energy it's using all throughout the day at different times of the day. And I don't think enough hospitals have someone who sits down and looks at that data and says, why are we using so much energy at 3 o'clock in the morning in this site that doesn't have many beds in it? I think there's huge savings to be made if we can just free up that time to look at that data and ask those questions and chase them down. Yeah,
That means hiring more staff, which we'll not get onto that one with no minutes to go. I think probably, Georgia, I might hand back over to you to close off the session, if that's all right. I think we've wound up the questions.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well done, guys. Super, super interesting. I think that there was a bit of a slow moment waiting for questions, but then they have all come flooding through, so I'm happy for you for that. So if anyone is interested in rewatching this, or if they want to send it on to someone that they think might be interested, the whole thing has been recorded, as Beth mentioned. It will be going out on the Sustainability Partnership website. We'll also share that with Inenco. I'm sure you guys will post that out across your social channels as well, and it'll be on our social channels for Sustainability Partnership. So just wanted to, real quick before everyone goes, we do have our Climate Change Summit on the 28th of October. So we have one session in the morning where we have people from the NHS talking about issues, challenges, thoughts, and things that they're coming up against from 10 a.m. And then in the afternoon, we have amazing partners like Inenco have shown to be today, who are offering up solutions, thoughts, and ways to tackle some of the issues that were brought up in the morning session. So I really hope that everyone can join us for either one or both of those sessions. We are still looking for any NHS partners who want to join in the conversation in the morning session. Anyone who wants to bring up any specific issues, challenges, targets, any of those types of things. So please do get in touch. I think that we may have put our information in the chat just now. So please get in touch with us that way. Other than that, thank you so much to Beth and Jack today. Thanks for your time and thanks for sharing all of your amazing insight and just your experience within the industry. I hope that people have taken away some great learnings and inspiration from today's session. Anyone wants to get in touch with Beth or Jack, please either contact them or get in touch with Sustainability Partnerships. We'll put you straight on to these guys. So thanks so much, guys, and thanks everyone for attending our webinar today, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one at the end of the month.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.